And from my perspective, we need bold transformation, not half measures to reform our immigration system. We must create pathways to citizenship, not just for Dreamers and TPS recipients, but for the entirety of the 11 million immigrants in our country. It is critical that we dismantle Donald Trump's deportation army and decriminalize unlawful entry. The United States of America was founded in part by refugees, and we should not close our borders, our shores, or our hearts to those seeking to have a better life in our country. It is absolutely imperative that we work with this community. And that's why I introduced the GRACE Act, legislation that would prevent a president from setting a refugee admission at a level below 95,000 people in a given fiscal year. The GRACE Act will reestablish our moral authority around the world and ensure that we do not forsake those most in need of our help. We must commit significant federal resources to support all immigrants. And by the way, Joe Biden has now said that when he is sworn in, he is going to take the GRACE Act and use it as his foundation. That's because we had already done the work to get every major immigration and refugee group in the United States to endorse the bill. So my bill is now the basis for what the Biden administration is going to do on that refugee issue. But we also need more. And that's why I introduced the New Deal for New Americans Act. And that legislation promotes immigrant and refugee inclusion, as well as coordinating the efforts of federal, state, and local governments to support the social, economic, and civic integration of immigrants and refugees. And so we just have to be aggressive. We have to do everything we can to ensure that we make our country an easy place, a welcome place for all immigrants to be able to join. Well, I was the first senator to call for halting deportations and enforcement actions during the coronavirus crisis. I was the first senator to say that. We must also release from detention all immigrants who pose no public safety threat. Detainees often reside together in crowded rooms, conditions that are ripe for a mass outbreak of coronavirus. This is a matter of human rights. And the Department of Homeland Security has the authority to do this and should have done so a long time ago. But I was the first to call for that. In June of 2019, at the peak of the detention crisis, I introduced legislation to use alternatives to detention for asylum seekers, migrant children and families, and other vulnerable groups. The Alternatives to Detention Act of 2019 would direct these individuals towards alternatives to detention programs, including community-based supervision, and ensure that we would help each and every one of them to be in a place where they could await the outcome of their immigration cases, but not with the draconian circumstances that exist today. From my perspective, we need a comprehensive immigration bill. That immigration bill would ensure that all of the DACA young people would be put on a pathway to citizenship. We have to do that right at the beginning of next year. But we have to do the same thing for all of the TPS recipients as well. We have to make sure that all TPS holders, there's about 5,600 in Massachusetts, they're put on a pathway to citizenship. But on top of that, we have to add in all immigrants. As I said before, all 11 million immigrants should be given an opportunity to get on a pathway to citizenship, and we have to pass that law in 2021. It has to be at the top of the list. We know that the United States was founded in part by refugees, and it's absolutely critical that we deal with in a comprehensive and humane way that issue. President Trump's decision to slash refugee admissions has been a drastic departure from our longstanding commitment to vulnerable people around the world and our understanding that the United States must be a leader in resettlement efforts. And that's why I introduced the GRACE Act that would prevent any longer there being a reduction in the number of refugees per year. I've taken a historic average of 95,000. I think that should be the floor. I think we should be able to increase it to 150,000, 200, 250,000 a year so that we have a place in our country for refugees. And in September of 2019, I introduced first of its kind legislation to address the climate refugee crisis. By 2050, there may be as many as 200 million climate displaced persons worldwide. And climate displaced persons include those in Central America, but from poor countries all around the world who are fleeing from food and water insecurity brought on by climate change. The climate crisis is fueling an humanitarian crisis around the world. And without intervention, the crisis will become a catastrophe. Women, children, the most vulnerable, those are who are going to be those who are adversely affected. And we have to make sure that in addition to conflict, violence, persecution, that we also have a global strategy to deal with the impacts of climate change. And we have to start that now. From my perspective, we just have to start with ensuring that everyone has adequate access to healthcare services, regardless of immigration status. Congress earlier this year expanded COVID-19 testing through Medicaid for the uninsured in prior coronavirus relief legislation. We must ensure that all uninsured individuals, including immigrants, qualify, and that all low-income communities, including immigrants, can access Medicaid-funded COVID-19 related medical care, such as treatment and vaccines, alongside coverage for testing. And next, we have to expand the coronavirus cash assistance that Congress provided in the CARES Act to include immigrant families who file taxes with an individual tax identification number because they're working hard. These people are paying taxes. And by excluding ITIN filers and their families members from access to cash payments, spouses and children and mixed status immigrant families will be denied critical economic support, including 5.1 million children, which is amazing and unacceptable. So we must remove the Social Security number requirement tied to the stimulus rebate to ensure that all immigrants can receive cash assistance. But that $1,200 check was not enough to help families get through this crisis. And that's why I introduced legislation that would provide every person in the United States, regardless of immigration status, with $2,000 per month for the remainder of the crisis. $2,000 per month per individual. I introduced that with Senator Kamala Harris, who's going to become our vice president. And I just think that for 3 months, she and I have been fighting for it, and we're not giving up, and especially since she has this new position of power. It's critical that people get the funding they need for food, for rent, for food, for medicine, for anything that is essential to their families' well-being. And we also need robust funding for government agencies and community-based organizations to provide information about coronavirus services in as many languages as possible. From my perspective, we have to just commit significant federal resources to support immigrants and refugees within our communities. And that is exactly what my legislation, the New Deal for the New Americans Act, will do. This legislation promotes immigrant and refugee inclusion, as well as coordinating the efforts of federal, state, and local governments to support the social, economic, and civic integration of immigrants and refugees. We know immigrant families want the opportunity to contribute to their communities and to provide for themselves and their loved ones. The New Deal for New Americans Act provides that opportunity, not just to survive in the United States, but to fully thrive as American citizens. So thank you all at MIRA for everything that you do. Thank you, Ava. Thank you, everyone there. You know I love you. You know that I've had your back for all the time that I've been in Congress, and I will have your back on the floor of the United States Senate next year if I'm fortunate enough to win. So thank you all so much for everything that you do for our community and being the model for our entire country. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to seeing you very soon.
This country is built on a proud legacy of welcoming immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and people seeking opportunity and the chance to realize the American dream. So we need a comprehensive immigration reform platform that is compassionate, that is decent and fair, that recognizes this country would not be where it is today without the proud contribution of immigrant families like my own, which is also an immigrant family. So for me, that means a fair and achievable pathway to citizenship to make it possible for the approximately 11 million people that are already here in our country to be protected. It means protections for Dreamers and TPS recipients who are integral to the fabric of our communities and contribute back to our nation. It means an immediate end to the inhumane family separation policies and the detention policies. Robust protections for asylum seekers and refugees, more lawyers and resources to help an influx of immigrants that are coming to our borders seeking shelter and protection. The separation of local law enforcement from ICE, systemic reforms to immigration enforcement agencies to root out abusive practices. Finally, it means a decriminalization of immigration. Not just a shift in policy, but a shift in values. It is not a crime to come to our nation to seek a better life for your family. Above all, we have to respect and treat immigrants with the dignity that they deserve, including any undocumented Americans, because I believe that's at the core of what our country is founded on. I've seen firsthand the devastation of this administration's inhumane immigration policies. I made several trips down to the border to examine those facilities, Tornillo, CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, ICE as well. And I visited a tender care facility in New York, where they were caring for children that had been ripped from their parents' arms. I've continually pushed the Trump administration for answers about dire medical conditions for infants and children in detention facilities, about the deaths of transgender immigrants, and about the process for reunifying migrant children with their families. We need to end these detention practices, full stop, no question. And as for immigration enforcement agencies, we have to end the cruel and inhumane practices and tactics that they've been employing. ICE needs systemic reform to root out abusive practices. We need to strip it down to its studs and rebuild it in a way that reflects our values. And that means holding them to the same due process standards as other law enforcement agencies. No more warrantless arrests or stops from our borders. Elimination of private detention facilities. Ending collusion between immigration agencies and local law enforcement, including here in Massachusetts. They should be reshaped to focus their efforts on homeland security efforts like screening cargo, identifying counterfeit goods, and preventing smuggling and trafficking. To change that culture, we have to insist on transparency and strengthen the authorities of independent internal watchdogs to prevent any further abuses. Finally, you can't lose sight of the fact that this isn't just about a broken agency. It's about an entire broken system that has been broken for a long time and that the Trump administration has exploited for their own political gain. We have to end it. Dreamers, brought here as children and raised here, and TPS holders seeking shelter and protection in a country that claims to offer better life. They're part of the fabric of our communities. They are students, they're workers, they're business owners, they're sons and daughters, they're brothers and sisters. They are Americans. It's absolutely critical that we protect them. What we've seen out of this administration is no surprise, but it is still heartbreaking. Trying to strip away the only life that some of these individuals have ever known, force them out of the only place they've ever felt safe. While there's some temporary relief from the Supreme Court striking down the administration's actions on DACA, that's not going to be enough. They've already ended crucial TPS protections for hundreds of thousands, and they'll keep trying to dismantle DACA and put our Dreamers at risk. We need to reinstate TPS designations and deferred enforcement departure to protect individuals at risk in their own home countries. We need to pass the DREAM Act immediately to expand and protect DACA and codifying protections for Dreamers and TPS recipients. We need a fair and achievable pathway to citizenship, as I talked about earlier. That has to be part of any set of comprehensive immigration reform principles. And it's absolutely critical that we change the makeup in Congress, because we have seen Republicans will not deliver on this promise. We have to change Congress to ensure that we will. As part of a comprehensive immigration reform platform, we need to ensure that we treat asylum seekers and refugees with compassion and dignity that they deserve. The United States has historically been a safe haven for refugees from around the world, seeking a better life, fleeing from violence and upheaval. But the Trump administration has done the unthinkable, denying asylum to migrants escaping violence and danger, turning away refugees, caging them like criminals, infiltrating our shores. He continues to desecrate our fundamental values, ignoring the words etched into the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. Comprehensive immigration reform needs to affirm asylum protections, to ensure that asylum seekers can safely present themselves at ports of entry for humane, efficient processing, to restore President Obama's promise to extend asylum for those fleeing domestic or gang violence, reform protections for gender identity and sexual orientation-based asylum claims, streamline the process, and to eliminate the backlog of asylum seekers waiting for adjudication. We also have to restore our role as a global leader in resettling refugees, immediately lifting the discriminatory bans that the Trump administration has put in place, and lifting cap on refugee admissions, passing legislation to prevent any president from setting a cap below 95,000 people per year. That number should be an absolute minimum. An annual admission number should vary in response to global events. Our admission policies should be guided by our nation's ideals and compassion towards those who are arriving on our shores, seeking shelter for a better life for them, my families, just like my family did all those years ago. Immigrant families are American families, period. And the federal government has every responsibility to provide them the same level of protection and relief during the national crisis. Cities across Massachusetts, like Springfield, Chelsea, Lawrence, East Boston, tell that story. Our immigrant workers are essential workers. But instead of treating them with the dignity this affords, we have too often exploited, abandoned, and abused them. So it should be no surprise that we see higher rates of infection and worse economic devastation in those communities. At the very start of this crisis, I introduced a proposal to auto-enroll every uninsured person in the country in Medicaid, regardless of immigration status. I'm working with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley to end ICE check-ins during this crisis and led an effort with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus to release detainees who pose no threat to public safety. I immediately called for accountability when there are allegations of mistreatment against detainees in the Bristol County Jail. And I fought with my colleagues in the House to pass a bill that would extend cash payments for many immigrant families. The Senate hasn't followed suit. I believe our country is made stronger, richer, and better by the contribution of immigrants. The federal government has a responsibility to help support immigrants to our country, who are often making difficult transitions to an entirely new culture, economy, sometimes language, and who make invaluable contributions to our nation and our economy day after day. We need to create resources and support services for immigrants to help promote employment opportunities, entrepreneurship, language learning, and civic engagement. And that has to include, in my mind, programs to help immigrant families access childcare, early education, and navigate public schools, English language support, economic integration initiatives to support business ownership and entrepreneurship, help navigate complicated loan and procurement systems, and of course, providing job training and financial stability counseling. You also have to add civic engagement initiatives like voter registration. And look, that comes back to groups like MIRA that do such an incredible job at all of these things in creating a community for immigrants across our community. I'm grateful for you. Thanks so much for having me, everybody.